This is the Old Testament Storyboard presented by Anna Kaiser. And in the first section of this storyboard, we will be covering Genesis 1 through 3 and the biblical narrative, just looking at a few categories that are introduced in Genesis 1 through 3, and just looking at their significance in light of the whole biblical narrative. So we're first going to explore God and what we learn about God in chapters 1 through 3. So what we learn about God is that he existed before the beginning of the world and that he actually created the world. We learn that God is orderly as he thoughtfully brings about all that is known in our world, and that he has authority over his creation as he both blesses it and commands the creatures to be fruitful and multiply in chapter 1, verse 22. We learn that there is a plurality in God. If we skipped ahead in the Bible, it's clear that there is a triune God, God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But from this first section of Scripture, we know that God says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." And after doing that, creates a man and a woman, the relationship of which will reflect how God is in relationship with himself or in community with himself. We learn that everything God does is good. We learn that he's especially interested in people as he watches what Adam names different parts of the creation and actually walks with Adam in the garden. In chapter 3, we see that God lays out consequences for Adam and Eve when they disobey him. He is fair in his judgments. So we see that he is good and we see that he is involved. And what do we learn about humans? We learn that they are created in God's image and given a special place in creation. That is dominion over other creatures. We see that in chapter 1, verse 26. They're given special attention by God as he gives humans instructions from the beginnings. He instructs them in what they can eat from, that they can eat from the plants, but not from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What do we learn about human interaction? We see interdependence. We see that God points out that it's not good for Adam to be alone. We see that there's a need for connection. It even says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And it's not a bad thing. It's a part of God's creation, that interdependence, where God says it's not good for Adam to be alone, and he creates Eve to fill that gap. But we also see that need for connection and reliance on each other go sideways when Eve leans in and relies on what the serpent shares with her, and Adam goes along with her rather than insisting that they wait for God and hear from him. We learn some things about the world. We learn that God intentionally created it. It was formless before he worked in it, and it is blessed by him. In chapter 1, verse 31, it says that God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. That is after completing creating the world. So the world was created very good. And what do we learn about the way creation reacts with the Creator? Well, creation reacts in total conformity to how it's created. We see the order that God established being carried out. Just one example would be morning and evening. They successively follow each other. So creation is being lived out in conformity to how God created it to be carried out. We learn about the problem of sin, unfortunately, in chapter 3, and it affects all parts of the creation. After the fall, God addresses each party that was involved in that fall separately. He first addresses the serpent, then Eve, then Adam. And from what he says to Adam and Eve, we know that humanity's interaction with creation moving forward is forever changed. Before this event of their disobedience, work was good, like all other aspects of creation, but now there will forever be an element of toil because of the curse of sin. there also is pain in childbirth and a difficulty in interpersonal relationships that was not present before when they were living in obedience to God and desiring Him most. We see that difficulty in interpersonal relationships in chapter 3, verse 16, where it says, "Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, and he shall rule over you." What is the solution for sin that we see in chapters 1 through 3 of Genesis? Well, it isn't fully resolved in Genesis 3. We do see that God dresses them in garments of skins so that they would no longer be naked. That skin came from somewhere, so most likely an animal lost its life for the first time, and Adam and Eve saw the consequence of sin being death. At the end of chapter 3, God says that He doesn't want them to have the opportunity to eat from the tree of life, because then they would live forever in this state of sin that contradicts His created purposes for them. For this reason, He drives them away from the Garden of Eden so that they wouldn't be locked into this state for eternity. So to sum up, God created a beautiful and perfect order intending blessing, but at the end of Genesis 3, humanity is driven from the land created for them, with pain guaranteed as they carry out multiplying that commission that God placed over Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. And they are confronted with the curse of sin that they brought upon themselves. So moving right along, we can skip a little bit. We're wanting to look at God's promise to Abraham and how God's promise to Abraham addresses that problem of sin that we just were looking at in chapter 3 of Genesis. And I won't read God's promise to Abraham, but if you read it, you can pick out three key parts of this blessing or this promise to Abram. And that is land, offspring, and blessings. And this promise in our textbook, Wright refers to this promise. He actually points out that Apostle Paul refers to this promise as the gospel in advance in his writings in Galatians. So what about this promise is the good news? What is the good news in this promise to Abram? And the good news really is found in those three components: the land, offspring, and blessings that God is addressing here. That's how the problem of sin is being addressed. So we're going to look at those three parts: land, offspring, and blessings. So looking at land first, there is no Garden of Eden without land. And that God created in the beginning, when God created a good world, Eden was the place where humans were experiencing creation as God had intended it, but He had to drive them out of Eden. So God is now promising land to be restoring that part of provision, that part of creation. So land is key to restoring the initial purpose God had in creation. And so God's promising to Abram that He is going to be providing land for him moving forward. Offspring. So this seems to be an especially important part of the promise. God reiterates this later in Genesis 15:5 when He tells Abram to look toward heaven and number the stars if you are able to number them. So shall your offspring be. So God's saying, look, this is important and this is going to be possible. You are going to have an impact on the world, on eternity, through your children and your children's children. And God is still invested in people. He still is looking at having the problem of sin be addressed through the increase of His people, Israel, and their obedience to Him. and then blessings instead of curses. So blessings, this is how we were intended to experience creation. And blessings is a tricky word. Looking at the textbook, blessings, it's constituted by fruitfulness, abundance, and fullness in the natural order, and by humans enjoying God's own rest within God's good creation. And it's to be enjoyed within a right relationship with God and others. So this is in contrast of the curse that was brought in from the fall from obedience to God. So looking at some examples of this, where can we find examples of land being provided, of offspring, of blessings in throughout the Old Testament? And so looking throughout the Old Testament, there's an example from the law of blessing. And I love this example. Again, I think it's helpful to remember a definition of blessings would be fruitfulness, abundance, and fullness in the natural order. It normally includes increase of family. So with that definition in mind, I immediately thought of Exodus 1, the increase of the people of Israel during their time of oppression in Egypt. And it's a wild story because they're being increased in a time when when the Egyptians are trying to suppress them, and the Pharaoh is even trying to bring the midwives into this plot of suppressing the Israelites. But the midwives are true to their faith and true to God and do not succumb to that pressure, and God even blesses them by increasing their families. So that's one example from the law of blessing the people of Israel, just increasing even in spite of oppression. An example from the prophets of this promise, God's promise to Abraham, would be land. When God gives the promised land to his people when they are acting in obedience to him. So acting in obedience was important. They had to be in obedience to him. Joshua 6 is the account of the wall of Jericho. When the people of Israel are acting in obedience, God just gives them the land there. And Joshua 7 is a different story where they are not acting in obedience and the land is not given to them. God needs them to be conforming to his will and his promises for them, for him to provide the promised land. And next example is from the writings covering people or offspring. And I just so much appreciated the presentation that the Bible Project did over the book of Ruth. And I wanted this to be my example of offspring because it highlights the story of a family, and the story begins in tragedy and ends with the birth of Obed, who is the granddad of King David, who of course is in the lineage of Jesus Christ. So it seems like an ordinary story, but it's not at all. The faith of this person, who's actually not even an Israelite, but she's included in the lineage of Christ. So she's kind of offspring from Abram. She's included as the people of Israel because she honors the God of her mother-in-law and really adopts that faith and lives in faith and integrity. And we do see her come from a place of being a widow to the place of being a wife and having offspring. And so I thought of that story as a great example from the writings of God's promise of offspring to Abram. So we see the unfolding of the story of the Old Testament. It just fits into the canon of the Bible, and that the account in Genesis 1 through 3 and the promise to Abram is foundational to the rest of the biblical narrative. And that concludes my presentation. This is my the references that I used in my presentation, and thanks so much for watching.